I'm a former British diplomat. I resigned from the Foreign Office over the Iraq War. And since then, I set up an NGO dealing with political causes for democratic countries and movements around the world. But since then, I've also had a journey where I've ended up as a believer in anarchism, which is a rather strange thing for somebody who comes from my background, which is very much government, top-down authority, neoliberalism, to believe basically the opposite of that. On Catalonia, I've got a history because my organisation used to advise the Catalan government on how to pursue self-determination and how to get acceptance for that internationally. So I have strong views about it. Obviously, I support the right of self-determination of the Catalan people, as I do more or less anywhere. I think self-determination is a fundamental right. And when groups of people want to have a new political dispensation, a new state, then they should be allowed to choose that, subject to certain conditions, the protection of minorities above all, pursuing it peacefully, the absence of international intervention from outside, for instance, so that would show that self-determination in East Ukraine, for instance, is not legitimate because of Russian military involvement, the violent way it's being pursued, the lack of democratic consensus or even any kind of democratic process. So very different. Catalonia is legitimate in my view, and the hostility of the Madrid government to what the Catalans have been trying to do is odious and totally counterproductive. But I also think it's important for the left to understand that Catalan nationalism is not an anarchist movement. We're not looking at 1937. To an extent, it's a bourgeois movement. And it has elements, Catalan nationalism has elements in it which I don't find particularly savoury. I went on some of the big demonstrations for independence on the Catalan National Day. And Barcelona is a very mixed, multi-ethnic city now. I didn't see any of those faces in that demonstration. Totally white demonstration. I might have missed them, but I didn't see any. And that struck me. That struck me. And the corporate elites are really behind nationalism to a considerable extent. And the main party, which used to be called Convergencia, which pursued nationalism, was a mainstream party. It wasn't the only party. The left parties also pursued it. Is very much a corporatist, centrist party. And I would say to the president, you know, there's a way of doing this that would bring national consensus, that would demonstrate a new kind of democracy of, you know, having local forums discussing this, coming together to try to create a consensus about the future. Because I think one of the real problems in Catalonia is there isn't consensus. If there were a legal referendum, it's not at all clear that the nationalists would actually win. I know the informal referendums, the majority of those who voted for independence, but that's because all those against independence didn't vote. And I think you have to accept that if you believe in the legitimacy of democratic process, there has to be a process which is accepted as legitimate by the population as a whole, where everybody gets a right to have their say and where that outcome is respected. In other words, something similar to what happened in Scotland. Which is, I think, the model of how Catalonia should be handled. What's happened in Rojava, the establishment of bottom-up self-governance, where women are on an absolute equal footing with men, where all ethnicities are given a voice, that did happen quickly because of the Syrian revolution and the collapse of the authority of the Assad regime. So it did come into being in northeast Syria quite rapidly. But it was the result of quite a long process of thought and education amongst Kurdish groups, which enabled that revolution to take place. It was part of a long discussion within the PKK and other groups. It was partly about the ideological conversion of, paradoxically, the very singular leader of the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan. So there was a longer history. And in the case of the Spanish Revolution, during the Spanish Civil War, when anarchist ideas were implemented in Catalonia, but not only Catalonia in particular, again, you saw there many years of education and discussion of these ideas, particularly in the labour unions, which preceded this moment that became available because of war. It's important to say that We don't need to wait for a war to implement these ideas, and I'm not suggesting that. But I think where you have an entrenched political and economic system, change is inevitably going to take longer. And it inevitably has to be fought on multiple fronts. It's not to say I accept the obstacles and the slowness of change. I think you can always make it faster. There's always stuff you can do to make change quicker. And one of the things that excites me actually now is the speed with which changes in social norms can be affected. I mean, in my lifetime, I've seen radical changes in, for instance, LGBT rights, to an extent in race relations in the US. And now with the Weinstein business, we're seeing a really important turning point in gender relations, power relations within genders, between genders. And I think that's very exciting that this stuff can happen so quickly now. So I think, new mechanisms have opened up for very rapid social change. In terms of institutional change, it's a longer term struggle, I think, but not necessarily. I could be totally wrong about that. Catalonia is complicated because there are hotspots where these ideas are gaining traction, and Barcelona is in fact one of them. But that's more thanks to Ada Colau, the mayoress of Barcelona, who's very committed to what she would, I think, call communalist ideas of local self-government. And she's been trying to institute this by having democratic forums set up in Barcelona to address Barcelona's problems. For instance, tourism. That's been a big concern of Barcelona citizens. But not only that. So she exemplifies, I think, an important trend that's starting local, but I think will have national manifestations. Rojava is certainly not the only place where these ideas are gaining traction. Interestingly, Greece has seen a lot of examples of anarchist self-organisation in response to the huge crisis caused by radical austerity in Greece, but also the refugee crisis, where anarchist self-organisation has been in many ways more effective than the government response. What I'm also seeing is a much greater openness to these kind of ideas than you saw like 10 years ago, where I think there was a belief that, moderate centrist politics would deliver the answers. Obama, particularly in America, was so popular and he was so much seen as a kind of savior figure on the left that I think it really silenced a lot of the discussion of radical alternatives. And now that he's gone and this horror show has begun in America, I think people are waking up to the fact that he wasn't able to fix the systemic problems. In some ways he represented them because he represented the very nature of politics. Vote for me and I will fix these problems, rather than we need broader systemic change where you too will fix these problems. Interestingly, his rhetoric on that changed during his 2 terms, but I'm digressing. So I do see these ideas gaining force and gaining traction, intellectual interest, momentum around the world.